They didn't ask who she was, didn't check her file, didn't notice the faded calluses on her palms, or the way her eyes tracked every exit in the room. To them, she was just another quiet woman in maintenance coveralls, unremarkable, easy to overlook, the kind of person you'd forget the moment she walked past. So when she arrived at Harrington Aerospace Logistics that Tuesday morning, no one paid attention. No one asked questions. No one saw anything worth seeing. That was their first mistake. The three of them found her in the east hangar around 2 p.m. Not by accident. Deliberate. They'd been waiting for an opening all week. A moment when the supervisors were in meetings, when the floor was thin, when she'd be vulnerable. Her name was Reynolds. At least that's what the ID badge said. Captain Alexis Reynolds, though she never told anyone her rank. She kept it quiet, kept everything quiet. The way she moved through the facility, methodical, precise, never wasting a gesture. It unsettled them in ways they couldn't quite name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The lead one was named Garrett Novak. Mechanic, second shift, the kind of guy who'd never advanced past his own ego but somehow convinced everyone else he was in charge. He had two shadows with him. Derek Hollis, thick-necked and aggressive, all muscle and no sense. And Tomas Reeves, the grin-and-nod type who laughed at whatever Novak said because it was easier than thinking for himself. Well, Novak said, his voice bouncing off the metal walls of the hangar. Look who's still here. Reynolds didn't turn around. She was checking the hydraulic lines on a Sikorsky frame, her attention entirely on the equipment. Not ignoring him, just uninterested. I'm talking to you, Novak called out, louder this time. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete. New girl. You deaf or just stuck up? She glanced back once. That was all. A single look, eyes level, expression blank. Then she turned back to the hydraulics. What happened next wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, the kind of thing that happens when three men convince themselves that silence equals permission. Hollis moved first, a shoulder check designed to throw her off balance. She absorbed it, feet firm, and didn't react. That emboldened them. Reeves laughed. A sharp, ugly sound that echoed through the empty hangar. Maybe we need to get her attention, Novak said. And there was something in his voice that made it clear this wasn't about attention anymore. He grabbed her arm. Not hard, just aggressive. A test. She pulled free, clean and controlled, but didn't say anything. Didn't yell. Didn't threaten. She just stepped back and returned to the hydraulic lines like they'd never interrupted her. That refusal to engage infuriated him more than any response would have. You think you're too good to talk to us? Novak circled, playing to his audience of two. You come in here with your quiet act, your gloves, your little notebook, acting like you're better than everyone else. Like you don't need to explain yourself to anyone. Still nothing from Reynolds. Just the sound of a wrench against metal. Hollis grabbed her shoulder this time, spun her around. When he's talking to you, you answer, he said. His voice dropped into that register where violence lives. And that's when it escalated. What happened next would be debated for weeks afterward. Reynolds turned to face them, eyes steady, and Novak saw something in her expression that made him hesitate for exactly 1 second. 1 second too long. But pride doesn't pause for reason. He shoved her hard toward the metal equipment rack. She hit the corner edge, caught herself with one hand, blood immediate on her lip where it split against her teeth. She straightened, touched her mouth, and looked at her fingers. Red. Metallic taste she knew the flavor of. One she'd tasted before in places that would make Novak's parking lot bravado look like child's play. But instead of reacting, instead of the tears or the protests or the anger they expected, she just looked at them. All three. One to the next. Calm. Measured. Like she was studying something fascinating. Like she'd just learned exactly what she needed to know. You should probably leave, she said quietly. Her voice was steady, almost conversational. Novak laughed. Hollis grinned. Reeves did what he always did, followed the lead. But there was something in Reynolds' eyes that didn't match her quiet tone. Something in the way she set her jaw. Something in the stillness of her body that suggested she wasn't afraid. She was just waiting. She walked past them without another word, past the equipment racks, past the supply lockers, toward the administration wing. Didn't run, didn't cry, didn't file a complaint right away, at least not where anyone could see. She just disappeared into the back corridors of Harrington Aerospace like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And that's when the real story began. Because what Novak, Hollis, and Reeves didn't know, what no one on that hangar floor knew, was that Captain Alexis Reynolds wasn't just maintenance staff. Wasn't just some quiet woman who kept to herself. Behind those calm eyes and that unassuming demeanor was a record that would have changed everything if anyone had bothered to check. Naval aviator, combat pilot, black belt in Taekwondo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, certified tactical instructor, active duty credentials that would make most people on that facility look like they were playing soldier. She'd come to Harrington Aerospace for one reason: a special assignment, deep cover, evaluating operations from the inside. And the last thing she expected was to be tested by 3 mechanics who had no idea they were about to teach her exactly what she needed to know about the culture of this place. But that lesson was about to come due. Before we show you exactly what happened next, how she turned the tables in ways they never saw coming, how the facility's command structure got involved, and how her final statement made every superior officer in that building reassess everything they thought they knew. Drop a comment telling us, would you have fought back immediately, or would you have done what she did and waited for the perfect moment? Smash that like button. Subscribe to this channel. Hit the bell icon so you never miss these stories of silent strength, hidden credentials, and the moment when the quiet ones reveal exactly who they've been all along. Because the most dangerous person in any room isn't always the loudest. Now let's get into it. Captain Alexis Reynolds had been in the military for 18 years, but no one at Harrington Aerospace Logistics needed to know that. Her file said she was maintenance personnel, transferred from a facility in the Pacific Northwest, recommended by someone in HR who'd never actually met her. The paperwork was impeccable. The background was clean. The references checked out. But the truth, the real truth, was buried 3 levels deep in classified channels that required clearance codes and encrypted access. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, when the weather in the region had turned gray and the wind cut through the hangar doors with the kind of bite that made most people move faster. Not Reynolds. She took her time. A small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, worn leather, the kind that had traveled through more time zones than most people could count. A canvas work jacket, unmarked, faded at the elbows. Black combat boots, scuffed but maintained, the laces double-knotted. No insignia, no rank visible. Nothing that would draw attention or invite questions. The intake specialist at the main security gate was named Patricia. Middle-aged, had worked at Harrington for 11 years, processed hundreds of new hires. She barely glanced up from her desk when Reynolds approached. Name? Patricia asked, fingers already hovering over the keyboard. Reynolds. Alexis Marie. Patricia typed it in. The system hummed. Her eyes scanned the screen, and she nodded once. Everything matched. Everything was in order. You're in Building C, East Maintenance Wing. Your supervisor is Marcus Thornton. You start on the floor tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. Here's your badge, your parking pass, and the employee handbook. Any questions? Reynolds shook her head. She took the materials, examined the badge for exactly 2 seconds, then clipped it to her jacket. Not a word. Not a smile. Just acknowledgement and movement. Welcome to Harrington, Patricia offered. The standard greeting worn thin by repetition. Reynolds nodded once and walked toward the corridor that would lead her to the employee barracks. What Patricia didn't know, what no one on that security gate knew, was that Reynolds had already assessed the facility in that 60-second walk. Had noted the camera placement, 3 visible, likely 2 more hidden. Had counted the security personnel, 6 on rotation, based on shift patterns she'd reviewed before arrival. Had identified the weak points in the perimeter, the corners that weren't covered, the maintenance access points that weren't regularly monitored. She'd done this in other places. Military bases, defense facilities, airports. It was muscle memory now, the way her eyes cataloged space and threat assessment the same way other people noticed if someone was attractive or if the coffee was good. The barracks were institutional. Concrete and fluorescent lights and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. Her assigned room was on the second floor, a single occupancy space, no roommates, which she'd specifically requested through channels no one here knew existed. The room had a bed, a locker, a small desk, and a window that overlooked the parking lot and the eastern perimeter fence. Perfect sight lines. Good exit routes. She unpacked the duffel. The contents were minimal. 4 pairs of identical maintenance coveralls. 2 pairs of black tactical pants. 5 neutral-colored t-shirts. 1 light jacket. A notebook with blank pages. Pen. A small canvas bag containing personal items. Toothbrush. Soap. A single photograph in a sealed plastic sleeve that she didn't look at. And at the very bottom, wrapped in dark cloth, a black belt. The kind that meant something specific to anyone who knew what to look for. She didn't unwrap it. Just left it there at the bottom of the duffel, where it would stay until it was needed. By evening, she'd memorized the facility layout. Had eaten alone in the cafeteria, sitting with her back to the wall, watching the dynamics of the personnel. Had observed who talked to whom, who had authority, who deferred, who pushed boundaries and who respected them. Had noted which mechanics took shortcuts, which supervisors looked the other way, which administrators actually cared about protocol. The information would matter. Not today, but soon. She'd been assigned to the East Hangar, working on hydraulic systems for the Sikorsky helicopters that came through for maintenance and repair. The work itself was straightforward for someone with her background. Hydraulics, avionics, structural inspection. She trained on every system they maintained here and on 5 others they didn't. Her hands knew the work. Her mind was already somewhere else, already observing, already building the map of the place and the people. On her first morning, she arrived at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes early. Not noticeably early, just early enough to walk the floor before the shift started, before the noise and the voices and the energy of 20 people waking up and getting ready to work. Marcus Thornton, her supervisor, was already there. Mid-50s, gray at the temples. The kind of man who'd been supervising maintenance crews for so long that the job had worn grooves into his personality. He looked up from his clipboard when she appeared. "Reynolds," he said, not quite a question. "Present," she replied. He nodded. "You'll be on the Eastern Line. We've got 3 birds coming in for hydraulic overhaul this week. Standard maintenance protocols. You familiar with the Sikorsky systems?" "Yes," she said. No elaboration. No false modesty. Just fact. "Good. The crew can get loud sometimes. Don't take it personally. It's just how things work here. You'll fit in fine if you keep your head down and do the work." She didn't respond to that. Didn't agree or disagree. Just took the assignment roster he handed her and walked toward her station. By the end of the first week, most people on the floor had stopped noticing her entirely. She was just there. Quiet. Competent. The kind of worker who showed up, did the job, didn't complain, and didn't try to make friends. She ate lunch alone, always in the same corner, always facing the exit. She wore gloves during all work. Black, unbranded. And kept them on even when other mechanics peeled theirs off in the afternoon heat. She never went to the break room. Never participated in the joking or the complaining or the casual cruelty that seems to build itself into workplace culture like sediment. She was there but not part of it. And that's when the attention started. Not the good kind. The kind that comes from people who don't understand quiet and interpret it as judgment. The kind that builds resentment in men who've never learned that strength doesn't always have to announce itself. By the second week, the whispers had started. She'd heard them. Not clearly. People were smart enough not to speak loud enough for her to catch full sentences, but she heard the tone. The dismissal. The contempt. The way her silence was being treated as proof of something weak rather than something controlled. She'd been underestimated before. In fact, she'd been counting on it. The East Hangar at Harrington Aerospace Logistics was a world unto itself. Massive, echoing, filled with the mechanical bones of helicopters in various states of dismantling and repair. The space sprawled across roughly 12,000 square feet, divided into 3 primary work zones. The northern bay where the airframes got initial assessment, the central area where major structural work happened, and the eastern section where Reynolds had been assigned, dedicated entirely to hydraulic systems and avionics integration. The culture of the hangar was distinct, shaped by the kind of work that demanded precision and the kind of men and women who'd learned to communicate through shorthand and volume. When hydraulic lines needed bleeding, you didn't politely request assistance. You called it out. When someone made a mistake, you didn't gently point it out. You laughed about it, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough to make sure they wouldn't make it twice. It was the economy of a workplace where ego and competence were often confused for the same thing. Marcus Thornton, the supervisor, was the fulcrum around which everything balanced. He managed through a combination of institutional knowledge and the kind of authority that comes from simply not caring what anyone thought about his methods. He knew every system in the hangar. He knew the timelines. He knew which contractors cut corners and which ones could be trusted. And he'd learned long ago that the best way to manage a crew was to let them establish their own hierarchy, then stay just far enough above it to maintain plausible deniability. The hangar had its own ecosystem, and like all ecosystems, it had its apex predators. Garrett Novak occupied that space. Not because he was the most skilled, he wasn't. Not because he had the most seniority, there were 3 other mechanics with longer tenure. But because he'd learned early that volume and confidence could substitute for actual competence, and that a crew would follow someone who seemed certain about what he was doing, even if that certainty was built on nothing but attitude. He'd arrived at Harrington 8 years ago, worked his way up to lead mechanic through a combination of showing up on time and never admitting when he didn't know something. He wore the kind of confidence that came from never being seriously challenged, from existing in an environment where his mistakes were overlooked or quietly corrected by others rather than addressed publicly. He had a crew of 4 or 5 people who orbited around him: Derek Hollis, who had the muscular build and the aggressive energy that Novak needed to reinforce his authority; Tomas Reeves, who was too insecure not to follow someone; and 2 others who simply preferred the path of least resistance. The hangar ran on this structure. Novak set the tone. His crew reinforced it. Everyone else either fell in line or found ways to stay invisible. Reynolds had chosen invisibility. For the first 2 weeks, no one paid her much attention. She showed up early, worked steadily through her shift, kept her station clean, and took lunch alone. She didn't try to join conversations, didn't laugh at the jokes, didn't participate in the elaborate social dance that bound the crew together. She was present but not part of the machinery. And for people like Novak, that absence of participation was a problem. On her 3rd Monday, she was working on the hydraulic manifold of a Sikorsky when Novak approached. Not to ask a question, not to request help, just to observe her, to test the waters. "You always this quiet?" he asked, leaning against the workbench like he owned it. Reynolds didn't look up from the manifold. She was checking the pressure seal, her movements precise, practiced, the kind of movements that came from doing something 1,000 times and never losing focus. "The work requires concentration," she said, her tone neutral, not dismissive but not inviting continuation either. "Work's not everything," Novak said. He was grinning, playing to the couple of mechanics who drifted closer, sensing entertainment. "You ever have fun? Ever just relax and be part of the team?" Reynolds completed the seal check, set down her tools, and finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "I'm here to maintain aircraft systems. That's my function." "Function," Novak repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he'd just been given exactly what he needed. A word to mock. A way to characterize her as something less than human, something mechanical and cold. "Well, aren't you something special?" He walked away, but not before making sure at least 3 other people had heard the exchange. The narrative was beginning to build. She was cold. She was unfriendly. She thought she was above everyone else. She was the kind of person who deserved to be taken down a notch. By Wednesday, the comments had escalated. Not directly to her. Around her. In the break room, Reynolds heard Novak describing her as stuck-up, describing her precision as paranoia, suggesting that she was probably some kind of corporate spy checking up on them. The comments never quite reached the threshold of something actionable. They were always deniable, always accompanied by a laugh or a gesture that could be interpreted as joking. But they were building toward something. Reynolds could feel it, could sense the shift in how people looked at her. The way conversations stopped when she walked past. The way Novak's crew had begun to move in a tighter orbit, their body language more aggressive, their voices louder when she was nearby. By Friday, the hangar felt different. The air itself seemed to have changed, charged with the kind of anticipatory tension that comes when a group decides that someone needs to be challenged. When a hierarchy senses a potential threat to its stability. Reynolds worked through the week without responding to any of it. Didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't try to be friendlier or more accessible. She just kept working, kept her station organized, kept doing her job at the level of precision that the work demanded. But her awareness had shifted. She was no longer just observing the hangar's culture and dynamics from a position of detached research. She was now watching the specific movement of three men, Novak, Hollis, and Reeves, tracking their patterns, understanding their psychology, noting the exact moment when they transitioned from posturing to actual threat. She'd seen this before, in different forms, different contexts, but the fundamental pattern was always the same. Men with fragile confidence confronted with someone who didn't need their validation would always eventually push. It was inevitable as gravity. The only question was when. And more importantly, what would happen when they did. The Monday morning after the first confrontation, Reynolds arrived at the hangar at the usual time. 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes early. The facility was quiet, the sort of pre-dawn silence that belongs only to industrial spaces before the people arrive to give them purpose and noise. She moved through the corridors with the same measured pace she always used, her work bag slung over one shoulder, her mind already cataloging the day ahead. The east hangar was empty when she got there. Just the helicopters, skeletal and waiting, suspended in the particular stillness that comes before a facility wakes up. She set down her bag, moved to her assigned workstation, and began the pre-shift checks on the manifold she'd been working on all last week. By 6:15 a.m., the first crew members started arriving. Not Novak. Never Novak. He liked to arrive right at shift start, liked to make an entrance that suggested he'd been doing important work elsewhere and was now gracing the hangar with his presence. The others filtered in gradually. Marcus Thornton, the supervisor, appearing with his ever-present clipboard. Derek Hollis, stretching his shoulders like he was preparing for combat rather than 8 hours of mechanical work. Tomas Reeves, already grinning about some joke he'd heard or invented. And then, at exactly 6 a.m., Garrett Novak walked in. He looked different this morning, more purposeful. His movements had a deliberateness to them that suggested he'd already decided something, committed to a direction. He didn't go directly to his workstation. Instead, he moved through the hangar with a kind of performative casualness, stopping to exchange words with other mechanics, laughing louder than the jokes warranted, establishing his presence and his authority before settling into the actual work. Reynolds noticed. Of course she noticed. Noticing was what she did. By mid-morning, the first real challenge came. It wasn't physical. It was designed to be subtle, deniable, the kind of thing that could be passed off as simple workplace dynamics. Reynolds was working on a pressure seal when Hollis approached her station. "Hey," he said, his tone already carrying an edge. "You're doing that wrong." She didn't look up. "The seal rating is 3,000 psi. The alignment is correct." "I didn't ask for an explanation," Hollis said. He stepped closer, invading the space around her workbench. "I said you're doing it wrong." Reynolds set down her tools. She turned to face him, her expression unchanged. "The procedure is documented in the maintenance manual. Section 4.2. The alignment I've completed is standard protocol." "Standard protocol," Hollis repeated, mocking the phrase. "You know what? Nobody asked you to think. Just follow instructions." He walked away before she could respond, but not before making sure at least 2 other mechanics had observed the interaction. The message was clear. She wasn't trusted. Her competence was questionable. Her authority was something to be challenged. This was the initial testing. The first probing of boundaries, designed not to escalate immediately but to establish that she was fair game. That the normal rules of professional courtesy didn't apply to her. That she was outside the protection of the crew's unwritten code. By early afternoon, the pattern had accelerated. Another mechanic, this one working under Novak's direction, deliberately placed a tool cart in her work path, forcing her to move around it rather than through it. A minor thing, a nothing, really, but purposeful. When she moved the cart, no one said anything, but the message had been received. She wasn't welcome in the shared spaces. She wasn't considered part of the crew. Thornton, the supervisor, noticed. She could tell by the way his eyes tracked the interactions, by the slight tightening around his mouth. But he didn't intervene. Not yet. In his experience, these things worked themselves out. Either the person being targeted learned to play the game, or they eventually left. Intervening too early just prolonged the process. During lunch, Reynolds sat alone in the corner of the break room, her back to the wall, a position that allowed her to observe the rest of the space while remaining somewhat removed from it. Novak held court across the room, his voice carrying easily across the distance. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, just performing for the audience of mechanics who'd gathered around him. You ever notice how some people just don't fit? He was saying, his tone casual, conversational. Like they show up somewhere and they're just wrong? Like they don't get how things work. Reeves laughed. Hollis nodded. I mean, I try to be helpful, Novak continued, building the narrative. I try to guide people, you know? Show them how we do things here. But some people, they just refuse to be part of the team. They think they're too good for it. Too special. Reynolds ate her sandwich. Turkey and mustard on wheat bread, consumed methodically, without seeming to hear the conversation. But she heard it, heard every word, was analyzing not just what he was saying but the response it was generating in the others, the way the narrative was being constructed and accepted. This was the second phase, the social isolation, the establishment of her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, someone who'd rejected the crew and therefore deserved whatever came next. It was classic, really. The pattern had ancient roots. Create the narrative that justified what was about to happen. Make it seem like her fault. Make it seem inevitable. By the end of the shift, the atmosphere in the hangar had shifted. The casual disrespect had evolved into something more pointed. When she requested access to a tool that one of Hollis's crew members had, she was told it would be returned eventually, a clear and deliberate delay. When she asked a straightforward question about manifold specifications, Novak answered it with exaggerated patience, speaking to her like she was slow-witted, like she should obviously understand something she just asked about. The other mechanics watched. Some looked uncomfortable. Others found the show entertaining. But none of them intervened. None of them pushed back against Novak. That was how the hierarchy worked. You either moved with the current or you got swept aside. As the shift ended and Reynolds began cleaning her workstation, Marcus Thornton approached. He stood for a moment, observing her work without comment. Then he said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You doing okay?" Reynolds didn't look up from organizing her tools. "The work is straightforward." "That's not what I asked," Thornton said. He exhaled slowly. "Look, Novak's a decent mechanic, but he's got issues with people who don't play the game. If you want my advice, you'll find a way to fit in. Make friends. Go out for drinks with the crew. Be part of something." Reynolds finally looked at him. Her eyes were still steady, still unreadable. "I'm here to maintain aircraft systems. That's sufficient." Thornton nodded, like he'd expected exactly this response. "Well, that's where you and Novak differ. He thinks being here means being part of the crew. And if you're not part of the crew..." He trailed off, not finishing the thought. He didn't need to. As Reynolds left the hangar that evening, the trajectory was clear. The initial testing had worked. She hadn't fought back. She hadn't complained. She hadn't tried to make friends or explain herself. And that refusal to play the social game, combined with her obvious competence, was creating a pressure that would eventually need to find release. Novak and his crew had established the narrative. They'd identified her as an outsider. They'd created the social permission structure for escalation. And now they were simply waiting for the moment when that pressure would break through into something physical, something undeniable, something that would give them the justification they needed. She was being systematically positioned as a target. and everyone in the hangar knew it whether they admitted it or not. The escalation happened gradually at first, then with increasing velocity, like a stone rolling downhill gaining momentum with each rotation. By Wednesday of the second week, the pattern had become almost ritualistic. Every morning brought a new variation on the same theme. Subtle challenges, public humiliation, boundary violations dressed up as workplace dynamics. Reynolds continued to respond the same way she had from the beginning. She didn't acknowledge the provocation, didn't file complaints, didn't seek allies or attempt to defend herself through official channels. She simply continued her work with the same precision and focus she'd maintained since day one. This consistency, paradoxically, made things worse. Because to men like Novak, silence could only mean one of two things. Either she was afraid or she was planning something. Neither interpretation was acceptable to him. Thursday morning, the confrontation took a different form. Reynolds was working on a particularly complex hydraulic assembly when Novak approached with a question that wasn't really a question. "Hey, Reynolds," he called out, loud enough that half the hangar could hear him. "You ever actually complete a full system check? Or do you just pretend to know what you're doing?" She didn't respond immediately. She was in the middle of a pressure calibration, the kind of work that required absolute focus. Stopping mid-procedure could compromise the entire system. "I'm talking to you," Novak said, his voice carrying an edge now, no longer attempting the pretense of casual conversation. Reynolds completed the calibration, set down her tools with deliberate care, and finally turned to face him. "The question was rhetorical," she said, her tone conversational, almost pleasant. "It didn't require an answer." The mechanics within earshot went quiet. This was the first time Reynolds had directly engaged Novak, the first time she'd offered anything more than silence or monosyllabic responses. It was also a direct challenge to his authority, dressed up in the language of simple observation. Novak's face darkened. "You think you're smart, don't you?" "I think precision matters," Reynolds replied. "In this work, it's the only thing that matters." She turned back to her workstation and resumed the assembly. But the damage was done. She'd broken the script. She'd responded to his provocation in a way that made him look foolish to anyone observing. And in the rigid social hierarchy of the hangar, that was a declaration of war. By Friday, the campaign had shifted into a new gear. It was no longer just Novak and his immediate crew. Other mechanics had joined in, either out of genuine agreement with his assessment or because the social current had shifted in a direction that made it safer to go along. The comments became more frequent, the challenges more direct, the boundary violations more brazen. During a supply run to the parts cage, Reynolds was cut off by Hollis, who deliberately stepped into her path and didn't move. It was a test of whether she would push back, whether she would challenge him physically or verbally. She simply waited, expression unchanged, until he moved. He laughed, interpreting her patience as weakness. When she requested a specific diagnostic tool, it was checked out by someone from Novak's crew. A lie, given that it was visible on the shelf behind them. When she asked Marcus Thornton about the schedule for the afternoon shifts, Novak interrupted, speaking over her entirely, his tone mocking the simplicity of her question. The systematic nature of it was almost impressive. It had all the hallmarks of a coordinated campaign, though Reynolds doubted Novak had been that deliberate in his planning. More likely, he'd simply set the tone and others had fallen in line, each iteration becoming more aggressive because the previous one had gone unchallenged. By Monday of the third week, the hangar felt different. The air carried a charged quality, like the moment before a storm breaks. Reynolds had become the focal point of an energy that had nothing to do with her as a person and everything to do with what she represented. A challenge to the established order, a refusal to acknowledge the hierarchy, an unwillingness to perform deference. That Monday afternoon, during the final hours of the shift, the escalation crossed from the social into the physical. Reynolds was working on a hydraulic line replacement when Novak walked past and deliberately bumped her shoulder. Not hard, just enough to be noticed. Just enough to establish that contact was possible, that her personal space was something he could violate without consequence. She didn't react, didn't stumble, didn't acknowledge it at all. 20 minutes later, as she was moving between workstations, Reeves stepped directly into her path and didn't move. She had to step around him, which meant deviating from her direct route, which meant acknowledging his presence in a way that fed his sense of power. And then, as the shift was winding down and most of the crew was beginning the process of cleaning stations and preparing for departure, Hollis made his move. He approached her workbench and, without preamble, grabbed the manifold she'd been assembling. "I need to check this," he said, not as a request but as a statement. "I'm not finished with the calibration," Reynolds said, her tone still measured, still controlled. "I don't care," Hollis replied. He pulled the manifold toward him and Reynolds moved to intercept, her hand reaching out to guide it away from the edge of the workbench. Their hands touched. It was incidental, accidental even. But in that moment, with Novak watching and Reeves positioned to observe, it became the justification for escalation. Hollis jerked his hand back like she'd burned him. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice loud, designed to carry across the hangar. "You initiated contact," Reynolds said. She was stating a fact, no emotion attached. "You calling me a liar?" Hollis stepped closer, his body language shifting into something more aggressive. This was the moment. This was the opening Novak had been waiting for. Novak appeared at the edge of Reynolds' workstation, his expression carrying something that might have been satisfaction. "Problem here?" he asked, though his tone made clear that he already knew the answer. "No problem," Reynolds said. She turned back to the manifold, attempting to return to her work, attempting to de-escalate the situation through disengagement. But Novak wasn't interested in de-escalation. He was interested in justification. "See, that's the problem with people like you," he said, his voice carrying across the entire eastern section of the hangar. "You come in here, you don't respect the people who've been here longer, you challenge everything, and then when someone stands up to you, you act like they're the problem." "I'm not acting like anything," Reynolds replied. She was still focused on the manifold, still attempting to maintain her work routine. "Exactly," Novak said. "You don't act. You don't feel. You're like some kind of robot, just going through the motions, looking down on everyone else like we're beneath you." The crew had begun to gather now. Some genuinely interested in the confrontation, some simply aware that something was happening and not wanting to miss it. The social structure of the hangar created momentum. Once Novak had started this particular performance, it would need to reach some kind of resolution. Reynolds set down her tools. She turned to face him, her expression still unchanged, still calm. "I'm not interested in this conversation." "Of course you're not," Novak said. "Because you're scared. You come in here all tough and competent, but you're just scared. Scared of being part of something. Scared of admitting that maybe you don't know everything." The comments continued, cycling through variations on the same theme. Incompetence, arrogance, refusal to be a team player. Each one designed to provoke, to push her into responding in a way that would give him justification for what was building in the room. Reynolds stood silent through all of it. Didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't attempt to counter his narrative or defend her position. She just stood there, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes level, her entire body language suggesting that whatever Novak was doing existed on a plane of reality completely separate from hers. And that refusal to engage, that absolute unwillingness to validate his provocation with a reaction, was the most infuriating thing that could have happened. Because it suggested something that Novak couldn't tolerate. That his words, his presence, his challenge didn't matter. That she was simply observing him, the way one might observe an insect or a weather system, with interest perhaps, but without emotional investment. By the end of the shift, the entire eastern section of the hangar was aware that something was building toward resolution. The question wasn't whether it would happen. The question was when. Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of weight that comes when everyone knows something is about to happen. The shift had been running normally enough on the surface, maintenance schedules being followed, systems being checked, the routine machinery of the hangar operating as it had for years. But underneath that veneer of normalcy, there was anticipation. The crew had been waiting, consciously or otherwise, for this moment to arrive. Reynolds had spent the morning working on a complex avionics integration system, the kind of detailed work that required absolute concentration. She'd moved through her tasks with her characteristic focus, seemingly unaware of or indifferent to the atmosphere building around her. But she was aware. She noticed when Novak arrived late to shift, nearly 30 minutes behind his usual time. She noted the way he'd moved directly to his crew without the performative greeting he usually offered. She observed how Hollis and Reeves had positioned themselves strategically throughout the hangar, their body language suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. By 2 p.m., most of the crew had begun the early wind down that typically preceded the afternoon shift rotation. Some personnel were heading out, their 8 hours completed. Others were preparing to transition to the maintenance logs, the administrative side of the work. It was during this transition period, when supervision was thinnest and the hangar most disorganized, that Novak made his move. Reynolds was working in the eastern section, near the supply area where the hydraulic components were stored. The space was somewhat isolated from the central hangar floor, blocked from direct sight lines by stacked equipment racks and the bulk of one of the helicopters currently undergoing overhaul. It was a space where something could happen without immediate observation from supervisory personnel. She heard them before she saw them. 3 sets of footsteps, deliberately heavy, moving with purpose rather than the casual pace of people simply traversing the hangar. When she turned, Novak, Hollis, and Reeves were already there, having approached from multiple angles to cut off easy escape routes. "We need to talk," Novak said. His voice was different from the mocking tone he'd used before. This was something harder, more serious. "Just the 4 of us." Reynolds straightened from the manifold she'd been examining. She didn't show concern, didn't attempt to move toward the main hangar floor. She simply assessed the situation with the same analytical precision she brought to every other aspect of her work. "I need to complete this assembly," she said, turning back to her workstation. "The assembly can wait," Novak replied. He stepped closer, and Hollis moved to his left, blocking one potential exit route. Reeves shifted to cover the other direction. The 3 of them had arranged themselves into a configuration that suggested they'd thought about this, had discussed positioning and approach. "You've been here 3 weeks," Novak continued, his voice carrying a tone that was almost conversational, almost reasonable. 3 weeks, and you haven't made a single effort to fit in. Not one. You sit alone. You don't talk to anyone. You look down on every single person in this hangar like we're beneath you." Reynolds didn't respond. She kept her hands visible, her body language relaxed but ready. She was evaluating distances, angles, the physical capabilities of the 3 men arrayed before her. "And the worst part," Novak said, "is that you think you're fooling someone. You think you're being clever or tough or something. But really, you're just being disrespectful. To me, to Hollis, to Reeves, to everyone here." "I'm not attempting to disrespect anyone," Reynolds said, her tone even. "I'm here to work, right?" Novak said. He laughed, a sharp sound that echoed off the metal surfaces around them. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. That tone, that attitude, like you're explaining something simple to children." He took another step closer, and Reynolds could see his shoulders tightening, his weight shifting onto the balls of his feet. This was the moment where it was about to become physical. She could feel it in the configuration of his body, in the energy of the space. "You need to learn how things work here," Novak said. "You need to learn some respect." What happened next occurred in the space of perhaps 5 seconds, though it would be debated and discussed for months afterward in various versions and interpretations. Novak reached out, his hand moving toward her shoulder, with the clear intention of establishing dominance through contact. Reynolds sidestepped the movement smoothly, her weight already shifting. Before Novak could adjust, Hollis lunged from the left, attempting to pin her against the equipment rack behind her. She moved again, pivoting her hips and rotating her shoulders to slip out of the space Hollis was trying to compress her into. Her arm came up, catching his wrist, and she used his own momentum against him, redirecting his forward movement into the metal edge of the equipment rack. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but hard enough that he gasped and stumbled back. Reeves, seeing his moment, moved in from the right. This was where it should have become dangerous, where 3 against 1 might have actually mattered. But Reynolds had trained for scenarios like this, had spent years learning how to neutralize threats, how to move through space with efficiency, how to turn aggression back on itself. She pivoted again, her center of gravity dropping as she completed the rotation. Reeves passed through the space where her upper body had been, his momentum carrying him forward. She caught his arm as he moved past, and a simple wrist rotation brought him to his knees. Novak, having recovered from his initial failed attempt, came at her again. This time he was more careful, more deliberate. He attempted to grab her arm to establish some kind of control. Reynolds turned into the grab rather than away from it, and suddenly Novak was off balance, his weight distributed incorrectly. A single shift of her hips and he was falling. The impact was loud. His body hit the concrete floor hard enough that the sound echoed through the eastern section of the hangar. For a moment there was silence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Hollis was on his knees, gasping for breath. Reeves was struggling to straighten, his arm still bent at an awkward angle from where Reynolds had held it. Novak was flat on his back, the wind knocked out of him, his expression shifting from rage to shock to the dawning realization that something had fundamentally changed about this interaction. Reynolds stood between them, her breathing elevated but controlled, her posture still upright and alert. She wasn't even looking at them, really. Her eyes were fixed on a point past them, on the space of the hangar beyond, as though this entire encounter had been so minor, so beneath her actual attention, that she was already done with it and moving on to the next thing. "Don't do this again," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried weight. Not a threat exactly, but a simple statement of fact. A boundary being established with perfect clarity. She turned and walked past them, past the equipment racks, back toward the central hangar floor where other personnel were now beginning to notice that something had happened. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge their presence, didn't validate their existence with so much as a glance. Behind her, Novak was pushing himself up on his elbows, his face flushed with humiliation and pain. Hollis was still on his knees, his breathing ragged. Reeves was examining his arm, checking for damage. And somewhere in the distance, Marcus Thornton was beginning to understand that the situation in his hangar had just undergone a significant shift. The medical office at Harrington Aerospace was located in Building B, a separate structure from the main hangar complex. It was a small facility, just 2 rooms, one for basic treatment and assessment, one for documentation and storage. The staff consisted of a single full-time medic, David Chun, who'd worked in field medicine for the Navy before transitioning to civilian work, and a part-time nurse who came in twice a week for the routine checkups and injury reports that were part of working in an industrial environment. Reynolds arrived at the medical office approximately 40 minutes after the incident in the eastern hangar. She'd finished cleaning her workstation, had changed out of her maintenance coveralls into a clean set, and had taken the time to walk the long route to avoid the main hangar floor where other personnel were still processing what had happened. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed against the silence of the late afternoon, a constant low-frequency sound that seemed to vibrate through the small waiting area. David Chun looked up from his desk as the door opened. He was in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of man who'd seen enough injuries and trauma in his career to recognize the difference between genuine emergency and something more measured and controlled. "Reynolds," he said, his tone carrying recognition. He'd processed her initial intake paperwork 3 weeks ago. "What happened?" Reynolds didn't answer immediately. She moved to the treatment chair and sat down, her posture still perfect, her expression still composed. The only indication that anything had occurred was the slight swelling on her lower lip and a small cut where the inside of her mouth had caught on her teeth. "Workplace incident," she said. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Hydraulic manifold issue. Lost grip during pressure calibration." Chun studied her for a moment. He'd worked with military personnel long enough to recognize when someone was providing an official narrative rather than an accurate account. But he also knew that if someone wasn't volunteering information, there was usually a reason for that choice. "Let me examine that," he said, standing and moving to wash his hands. The examination took approximately 10 minutes. Chun checked the swelling on her lip, had her move her jaw through various ranges of motion to assess for damage, looked inside her mouth to evaluate the cut. He was professional, efficient, asking questions only when necessary for his assessment. "Nothing appears broken," he said finally, returning to his desk. "The swelling will subside within a few days. The cut inside your mouth will heal on its own. You're going to be sore, but you've had worse." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, the kind that comes from someone who's learned to read bodies the way other people read books. Chun had noticed the small scars on her hands, the way her muscle tone suggested training beyond what normal maintenance work would produce, the absolute lack of fear or anxiety in her demeanor. "I need this documented," Reynolds said. She pulled out a small notebook from her jacket pocket, the same one she carried everywhere and never opened in public. "Official incident report." Chun hesitated. An official report would mean paperwork, would mean notifying Marcus Thornton, and potentially bringing in administrative personnel to assess the situation. It would put this incident on record, which would make it much harder to simply move past. "You sure about that?" he asked. "Sometimes these things are better handled informally." "I'm sure," Reynolds replied. "I need this documented." Chun nodded slowly. He understood what she was doing, or at least he understood the outlines of it. She was creating an official record of an injury that had occurred on company premises. She was establishing documentation that would be difficult to contradict or bury. She was, in her own way, filing a complaint without actually filing a complaint. He moved to his computer and began typing. "Date of incident? Friday, approximately 2:15 p.m., Reynolds said. "Location, Eastern Equipment Section of the main hangar. Nature of injury, blunt trauma to face. Secondary, small laceration to interior mouth. Cause, contact with equipment during manifold work. No witnesses confirmed." As Chun typed, entering the information into the official medical documentation system, Reynolds continued speaking in that same measured, factual tone. She described the incident with clinical precision, providing details that were accurate while carefully framing them in a way that technically aligned with her stated explanation about the manifold. "Are you filing for workers' compensation?" Chun asked. "This would qualify if you wanted to." "No compensation claim," Reynolds interrupted. "Documentation only. I want this logged in the system. I want there to be an official record that this incident occurred, when it occurred, and what the injuries were." Chun understood. She wasn't looking for sympathy or official protection. She was creating a paper trail. She was establishing, through documentation, that she'd been injured at work, that the injury had been assessed medically, and that she'd chosen not to file a compensation claim or pursue further action. It was the kind of documentation that mattered in situations where things escalated further, where official investigations might eventually be required. He completed the form, printed it out, and slid it across the desk toward her. "You need to sign this, and I need your acknowledgement that you've been medically evaluated and released to return to work." Reynolds signed the form with a steady hand. Her signature was precise, controlled, the kind of signature that looked the same every single time it was written. "One thing," Chun said, his tone shifting slightly. "If this happens again, if someone does this intentionally rather than as an accident, that's a different situation. That becomes assault, and you need to report that through official channels." Reynolds looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were steady, unreadable. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" Chun leaned back in his chair. "Because I'm telling you right now that what I see in your mouth doesn't match the story about a manifold. I've treated enough injuries to know the difference. And if someone is hurting you, if this was deliberate, there are people at Harrington who need to know about that. If that becomes necessary, I'll report it," Reynolds replied. She stood carefully, testing her jaw as she moved. "Thank you for the assessment." She walked toward the door, and Chun called out after her. "Reynolds, if you need help, if you need someone to escalate this to command, you come back here. You understand." She paused at the door. She didn't turn around. "I understand," she said. Then she was gone, walking back out into the late afternoon, carrying with her the official documentation of her injury, the proof that this had happened, the evidence that would matter when everything that came next began to unwind. Back in the medical office, David Chun sat at his desk, looking at the incident report he'd just filed. He'd seen this kind of documentation before, had worked with military personnel who used official channels in precisely this way. She wasn't reporting the incident because she needed help. She was reporting it because she was planning something, because she understood that official documentation would matter, because she was thinking several moves ahead in a game that most people hadn't even realized was being played. He pulled up her initial intake file on his computer. The information was sparse. Alexis Reynolds, transferred from Pacific Northwest facility, maintenance personnel, no medical history noted, no emergency contacts listed. But there was something in the blank spaces of that file, in what wasn't written down, that suggested to Chun that he'd just met someone whose presence at Harrington Aerospace was far more significant than her job title indicated. By the time Reynolds returned to the barracks that evening, word had already begun to spread through the facility. 3 men had been in the eastern hangar section, had been found in various states of disarray, and one of them, Novak, was claiming he'd slipped on hydraulic fluid. The story didn't quite hold together, but it was the official narrative, and most people at Harrington knew better than to question it too directly. What they didn't know was that there was now a medical report in the system documenting Reynolds' injury. A record. Proof. The first piece of evidence in a chain that was about to become very, very important. The administrative offices at Harrington Aerospace occupied the entire second floor of Building A, a structure that stood apart from the hangar complexes and maintained its own security protocols, its own climate control, its own quiet distance from the industrial noise of the facility's primary operations. It was a space designed to project competence and order, with filing systems and documentation protocols that had been refined over decades of defense contracting work. On Monday morning, approximately 72 hours after the incident in the eastern hangar, Lieutenant Colonel James Westbrook, the facility commander, was reviewing routine administrative updates when something caught his attention. It wasn't dramatic. Just a flagged notation in the medical records system indicating a new incident report filed by medic David Chun. The incident had been marked as equipment-related, but Chun had added a secondary notation suggesting that the attending staff member should review it at their discretion. Westbrook pulled up the full report. He read it carefully, his eyes moving through the clinical language and the precise documentation of Reynolds' injuries. He'd been in military administration long enough to recognize what he was reading. Not just an incident report, but a statement. Someone had documented an injury, had been medically evaluated, and had chosen not to pursue immediate administrative action but had made sure that there was an official record. He opened a second window and pulled up the personnel file for Captain Alexis Reynolds. The file was sparse, which was unusual. Standard personnel files included employment history, background verification, training certificates. Reynolds' file contained the basics, name, position, assigned duty, but very little else. Most of the supporting documentation appeared to be classified or restricted. That was the first indication that something about this situation was not standard. Westbrook closed the Reynolds file and instead accessed the main personnel directory for the Eastern Hangar section. He pulled up Garrett Novak's employment record. 8 years at Harrington. Performance reviews that were adequate but not exceptional. No disciplinary actions on record. But there was a pattern in the notes. Complaints from other personnel, comments about workplace dynamics, observations from supervisors about his tendency to create tension among crew members. By mid-morning, Westbrook had begun a quiet review of the situation. He didn't call anyone into his office, didn't make official inquiries. Instead, he requested that the security system pull footage from the Eastern Hangar section for the time period around the incident. The footage arrived within the hour. What Westbrook saw in that footage didn't match Novak's claimed explanation about slipping on hydraulic fluid. The video clearly showed 3 men approaching a single individual with deliberate positioning. It showed physical contact initiated by the 3 men, showed attempts to establish dominance through spatial control and aggression. And it showed Reynolds responding with movements that were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. The more significant detail, however, was what the video demonstrated about Reynolds' physical capabilities. the way she moved, the efficiency of her technique, the absolute lack of hesitation or uncertainty in her responses. It was the movement pattern of someone who'd been trained extensively in unarmed combat, someone who understood leverage and joint manipulation and momentum redirection the way most people understood walking. Westbrook sat back in his chair and made a decision. He picked up his secure phone and made a call to a number that wasn't in any official directory. The conversation that followed was brief and conducted in the kind of code that was understood by people operating at certain levels of military and intelligence work. "We need to verify something about one of our maintenance personnel," Westbrook said. He provided Reynolds's basic information. "I need confirmation on her actual status and assignment." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, "Stand by." The callback came approximately 4 hours later. Westbrook took the call in his private office with the door closed. "Captain Reynolds is verified," the voice on the other end said. The tone was bureaucratic, careful. "She's on assignment. Her presence at Harrington is part of an ongoing evaluation. She should not be interfered with or removed from her assignment. Any operational concerns should be reported through standard channels." "Do you understand?" Westbrook understood perfectly. Reynolds wasn't maintenance staff. Reynolds was intelligence or special operations or something in that category. Reynolds was at Harrington Aerospace for a reason that had nothing to do with maintaining hydraulic systems. And whatever assignment had brought her there was important enough that she had official protection from above. "Understood," Westbrook said. "There was a workplace incident on Friday. 3 personnel engaged in physical contact with her. She was medically evaluated and has filed an incident report. The security footage shows the incident clearly. I wanted to verify her status before taking any administrative action." Another pause. "What happened to the 3 personnel?" "They were subdued without injury. They're claiming they slipped." The medical report on Reynolds indicates blunt trauma consistent with the security footage showing contact initiated by the 3 men. "I see," the voice said. "Thank you for the notification. Stand by for additional guidance." The call ended. By Tuesday afternoon, things had begun to shift within Harrington's administrative structure, though the changes were subtle enough that most personnel would have missed them entirely. A routine maintenance schedule update was posted to the facility bulletin board. It was a minor adjustment, just a rearrangement of training rotations and evaluation blocks to account for personnel changes and shift requirements. But embedded within that schedule was something significant. A new leadership evaluation block, scheduled to begin Monday morning of the following week. The instructor listed was Voss A. The assignment groups had been carefully constructed to include Garrett Novak, Derek Hollis, and Tomas Reeves. The posting was done quietly, handled through standard administrative channels, with no special announcement or attention drawn to it. Most of the hangar personnel wouldn't even notice the schedule change. And those who did would simply assume it was routine reassignment. What no one except Westbrook and his command chain knew was that the decision had come from several levels above him. Someone in the military intelligence apparatus, or possibly in the Navy Special Operations Command structure, had looked at the situation. An active duty captain on an intelligence assignment being assaulted by civilian contractors, and had determined that the appropriate response was to allow her to handle it through official channels with full authority and institutional backing. The paperwork for that authorization had begun moving through the system on Monday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, it was complete. Captain Alexis Reynolds' personnel file was quietly updated to reflect her actual status. Her instructor certifications were added to the system. Her black belt credentials in multiple martial arts disciplines were documented. Her authority to conduct training evaluations and leadership assessments was officially recognized. All of this happened in the background, in the spaces between official announcements and public communications. No one made a formal statement about it. No one called a meeting to explain the changes. The information was simply there, available to anyone with access to the appropriate systems, documented and official and legally binding. By Friday evening, when Reynolds was preparing to leave for the weekend, the administrative groundwork had been laid. The schedule was posted. The authority was in place. The documentation was complete. All that remained was for Monday morning to arrive. Novak, Hollis, and Reeves had no idea what was coming. They'd been assured by each other that the incident was over, that Reynolds had been sufficiently intimidated, that the hierarchical order of the hangar had been restored. They hadn't checked the new training schedule, hadn't looked at the instructor assignments, hadn't realized that the woman they'd attacked was about to be placed in a position of absolute authority over their performance assessment. They were about to learn, in the most conclusive way possible, what happened when you underestimated someone, when you mistook silence for weakness, when you assumed that the quiet person in the room was incapable of response. By Monday morning, everything would change. But for now, over the weekend, the preparation continued in silence, the way the most important things often do. The Monday morning air at Harrington Aerospace carried the kind of crisp quality that comes with the transition from autumn into early winter. The temperature had dropped over the weekend, bringing with it a clarity that seemed to sharpen every detail of the facility. The drill yard outside the main hangar complex was already in use by 6:45 a.m., with various crews beginning their preliminary assessments and formations. Reynolds arrived at 6:30 a.m., earlier than the scheduled start time for the evaluation block. She was dressed differently than she'd been during her 3 weeks of maintenance work. Black tactical training pants, a fitted gray shirt with no insignia or branding, black gloves, the same ones she always wore, but now they seemed to carry different weight, different meaning. She carried a clipboard with official documentation and a small notebook. By 7 a.m., the personnel for the evaluation block had begun to assemble. The formation was composed of approximately 25 individuals, a mixture of mechanics, technicians, contractors, and a few military observers. Among them were Garrett Novak, Derek Hollis, and Tomas Reeves. They were laughing when they arrived, confident in the way that comes from believing a situation has already been resolved. Novak was making jokes to the others about the schedule change, suggesting it was probably some kind of routine training rotation. The laminated schedule was posted on the notice board near the equipment racks. Marcus Thornton pointed it out to anyone who seemed confused about which evaluation block they were assigned to. Joint Physical Readiness Assessment. The header read, Instructor of Record, CPO Voss, A. Novak stared at the posting for approximately 3 seconds. Hollis looked at it, then at Reeves, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion. CPO Voss, Novak said, speaking to no one in particular. Who the hell is? He stopped mid-sentence as the side door to the evaluation complex opened and Reynolds stepped out. She looked different in a way that went beyond the clothing. Her posture was different. Her bearing had changed. She moved with the kind of authority that comes from official position and institutional backing, from knowing that every person standing in formation in front of you has already been told to comply with your directives. She approached the formation without rushing, without any unnecessary gesture. She stood in front of the assembled group, and the conversation that had been ongoing in the formation died immediately. People recognized command presence when they saw it, even if they didn't fully understand what they were looking at. Good morning, Reynolds said, her voice carrying clearly across the drill yard. I'm Captain Alexis Reynolds. For the next 2 weeks, I'll be conducting a physical readiness and leadership assessment for this facility. This is a standard evaluation, conducted quarterly by command. Your participation is mandatory. Your performance will be documented. Your results will become part of your personnel file. She paused, allowing that information to settle into the group. Novak was staring at her, and she could see the moment he connected the dots, the moment he realized that Reynolds and CPO Voss were the same person, that the woman he'd assaulted 3 days ago was now his commanding officer. The schedule on the board details your assignment groups and station rotations, Reynolds continued. She held up the clipboard. I've arranged the groups based on facility records and performance data. Novak, Hollis, and Reeves, you'll be in the first rotation group. Station 1, 0700 hours. The assessment is designed to measure physical capability, technical knowledge, and decision-making under stress. She turned slightly, addressing the full group again. I expect professional conduct during this evaluation. I expect adherence to instructions. I expect honest effort and legitimate performance. Any attempt to circumvent or undermine this assessment will result in immediate removal from the program and notation in your personnel file. Are there any questions? No one spoke. The silence was complete and absolute. Excellent, Reynolds said. You have 30 minutes to change into appropriate workout attire and prepare for station rotations. Dismissed to preparation. The formation dispersed, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. Personnel who'd been casual and confident moments before were now moving with a different energy, a different awareness. Word was already spreading through the crowd. That was Reynolds, that was the woman from the hangar, that was the one who'd been assaulted and had apparently reported it through official channels, and now she had institutional authority over all of them. Station 1 was set up in the primary assessment bay of the evaluation complex. It was designed to test practical capability under pressure, a combination of tasks that required strength, precision, and endurance. The test itself was straightforward. 2 weighted cases, 40 pounds each, had to be carried in a diagonal sprint across a 40-meter course marked with painted lines. The cases had to be loaded into a designated crate at the end of the course, secured properly, and the entire process had to be completed in under 30 seconds to meet the standard. Reynolds stood at the station with her clipboard, her expression completely neutral. She'd positioned herself to observe every movement, every mistake, every deviation from proper technique. Novak approached the starting position. He was clearly attempting to project confidence, trying to demonstrate that none of what had happened in the hangar had affected him. He picked up the first case with a jerking motion, no proper grip alignment, no attention to body mechanics. "Start timer," Reynolds said, her voice flat, professional, carrying no emotion. Novak moved through the course, his form sloppy, his breathing already labored halfway through. He reached the crate, dropped the first case in without securing it properly, jogged back for the second case. His return trip was slower, his movements less controlled. By the time he finished, he was clearly winded. Reynolds glanced at the stopwatch she was holding. 34 seconds, she said, marking something on her clipboard. Failed standard. Insufficient grip control on initial load, improper weight distribution during transit, failure to properly secure crate contents. Rest period, 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Hydrate if needed. Novak turned to her, and she could see the frustration in his expression, the way his jaw tightened. But he couldn't argue. The standards were objective. His performance had been substandard. The documentation was real. Hollis performed slightly better but still failed to meet the time requirement. His form was marginally more controlled, but his power-to-weight ratio wasn't sufficient for the task, and he clearly lacked the conditioning to complete the circuit efficiently. Reeves, surprisingly, came closer to the standard, but made a critical error. He failed to properly secure the crate lid after loading the second case, which meant the contents could have shifted or fallen during transport. Technical failure. All 3 of them failed Station 1. Station 2 was more complex. It was designed to assess partner-based problem-solving and physical control under resistance. 2 participants would work together, one attempting to establish control through leverage, the other attempting to break that control. The exercise emphasized technique over strength, which meant that someone with proper training would defeat someone with just raw power. Novak and Hollis were paired together. Reynolds observed as Novak attempted to establish what he thought was a control position, but his technique was fundamentally flawed. He was relying on upper body strength rather than proper joint positioning and leverage. Hollis broke the hold in approximately 2 seconds, which should have been a clear indicator that the technique wasn't working. But instead of adjusting, instead of recognizing that his approach was incorrect, Novak simply tried the same thing again with more force. Failed again. Technique failure, Reynolds noted, writing on the clipboard. Control not maintained. Ineffective leverage application. 0 points for this station. Station 3 was the final assessment for the first rotation group. Close quarters control evaluation. Single defender attempting to maintain position against an attacker attempting to establish dominance or break contact. Reynolds ran Novak through this station personally, which was technically allowed but unusual. Novak seemed to interpret it as an opportunity to prove something, to demonstrate that he could overcome her in some way that would validate his earlier assault. He was wrong. The assessment began simply, Novak attempting to push Reynolds back, to establish dominance through direct contact. Reynolds sidestepped the initial push, rotated her hips, and established what's known as a back control position. Positioned behind him, her arms across his torso. The position was secure. Breaking it would require technique Novak didn't possess. Controlled, Reynolds said, her voice the same neutral tone she'd used throughout the assessment. Attempt to break contact. Novak struggled. He pushed backward, attempted to rotate, tried to use his greater weight to dislodge her. None of it worked. Reynolds simply maintained her position, demonstrating perfect technique, perfect control. After 30 seconds, she released him and stepped back. Assessment complete, she said. Performance review. Failed all 3 stations. Technique deficiency, insufficient conditioning, improper form execution. Evaluation results will be documented and filed with command. By the time the first rotation was complete, it was clear to everyone observing that something significant had shifted. Reynolds had demonstrated not just authority, but actual capability. She'd shown that her position wasn't ceremonial. It was based on genuine expertise and institutional backing, and she'd shown it in the most conclusive way possible, through objective assessment and documentation. Novak left the evaluation bay in silence. Hollis followed. Reeves was already moving toward the hydration station, his earlier confidence completely replaced by the kind of awareness that comes from realizing you've fundamentally misjudged a situation. And Reynolds, her assessment complete, returned to her station with her clipboard, ready for the next rotation group, her face showing no satisfaction, no triumph, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred. She was simply doing her job. And that job, it turned out, was exactly what needed to happen. The command review was scheduled for Wednesday morning, held in the administrative wing of Building A, in a conference room that had been designed for exactly these kinds of formal proceedings. The room itself was austere. A long table, ergonomic chairs, indirect lighting that was bright enough to eliminate shadows, neutral walls that suggested impartiality and official purpose. Present in the room were Lieutenant Colonel James Westbrook, the facility commander, Major Patricia Hendricks, the operations officer, a representative from the administrative division, and the 3 subjects of the review, Garrett Novak, Derek Hollis, and Tomas Reeves. Reynolds was also present, standing rather than seated, her position at the far end of the table suggesting formal witness status rather than defendant participation. Westbrook opened the proceeding by acknowledging that this was an informal review, not a formal hearing, but that the outcomes would be documented and would become part of their official personnel records. He then outlined the timeline. An incident occurring on Friday, December 15th, at approximately 2:15 p.m. in the eastern hangar section. Medical evaluation conducted immediately thereafter. Physical evidence gathered through facility security systems, and the subsequent assessment conducted during the training evaluation program. Before we proceed, Westbrook said, I want to be clear about what we're reviewing here. We're not reviewing what happened during the training evaluation. Captain Reynolds' assessment of your physical capabilities is exactly what it was designed to be, an objective measurement of your performance against established standards. What we're reviewing is the incident that occurred on Friday and the circumstances surrounding it. He gestured to Major Hendricks, who opened a laptop connected to the conference room's display system. The security footage from the eastern hangar appeared on the screen, high definition, clear angle, showing exactly what had occurred. The video played without commentary. Novak, Hollis, and Reeves approaching Reynolds' workstation. The initial posturing. The first contact, Novak's hand on her shoulder. The rapid sequence of movements that resulted in all 3 men on the ground. The video was approximately 90 seconds long, but it communicated everything that needed to be communicated. When the video concluded, Westbrook turned to Novak. Corporal, you filed a report stating that you slipped on hydraulic fluid. That's not consistent with what we're seeing in this footage. Would you like to revise your account? Novak's face had gone pale during the video playback. He was clearly processing the reality of his situation, that everything he'd done, every motion, every aggressive act, was now documented and displayed and undeniable. Sir, Novak started, then stopped. He looked at Reynolds, then back at Westbrook. I don't know what happened. It was fast. We were trying to talk to her and something went wrong. What went wrong? Westbrook asked, his tone remaining neutral and professional. Novak paused, seeming to struggle with how to frame what came next. She moved. She did something. The next thing I remember, I was on the ground. You initiated physical contact, Westbrook said, pointing to a specific moment in the video. You placed your hand on Captain Reynolds' shoulder with clear aggressive intent. You were attempting to establish dominance through physical contact. Is that accurate? Novak didn't respond immediately. The silence extended, heavy with the weight of what everyone in the room already knew. Yes, sir, he finally said. Westbrook turned his attention to Hollis. Your actions in the footage are similar. You approached from her left side, attempted to pin her against the equipment rack. You initiated contact. You were attempting to restrict her movement and establish physical dominance. Is that also accurate? Hollis nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. And you, Reeves? Westbrook continued. You approached from her right, initiating what appears to be a grab attempt. You were coordinating with the other two individuals to overwhelm her through numerical advantage. Reeves was staring at the table, his jaw clenched. What we have here, Westbrook said, his tone becoming slightly harder, is 3 military personnel, because you are military or contractors operating under military authority, who initiated physical assault against another military officer. That's Article 15 territory at minimum. That's grounds for courts-martial. That's the kind of incident that ends careers. He paused, allowing that reality to settle into the room. However, Westbrook continued, Captain Reynolds did not file a formal assault complaint. She did not pursue legal action. She filed a routine medical incident report and, through proper administrative channels, requested to conduct a training evaluation. What she did was exercise restraint and allow the proper channels to function. Reynolds stood absolutely still, her expression unchanged. She wasn't looking at Novak or the others. She was simply present, a factual element of the proceeding. But here's what's also clear from the evidence, Westbrook said. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the result of a systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation conducted over 3 weeks. We have statements from other personnel at the facility who have documented your behavior toward Captain Reynolds. Exclusionary tactics, verbal harassment, boundary violations, deliberate attempts to isolate and intimidate someone you perceived as an outsider. Major Hendricks pulled up a document on the screen, a summary of statements collected from various hangar personnel, corroborating the pattern of harassment. So here's what's going to happen, Westbrook said, his tone becoming formal and absolute. Corporal Novak, you are being reduced 1 rank effective immediately, under Article 15, for unauthorized physical assault and conduct unbecoming. You will serve a formal reprimand that will remain in your permanent record. You are being reassigned out of the hangar operations and will be working administrative support for the next 6 months, during which your conduct will be under direct supervision. Novak's face was now completely drained of color. The reduction in rank was not just a symbolic punishment. It was a financial penalty, a status reduction, a permanent mark on his career record. Derek Hollis and Tomas Reeves. Westbrook continued. You are being removed from the Joint Integration Program effective immediately. You will be transferred to different assignments within the facility, and you will undergo a formal conduct review over the next 90 days. Any further incidents involving similar behavior will result in termination of employment. Reeves put his face in his hands. Hollis simply stared ahead, processing the consequences of his actions. Additionally, Westbrook said, turning his attention to the administrative representative, all group communications related to this matter are to be archived and locked. No further discussion of these events is to occur on facility grounds. Any personnel engaging in subsequent harassment, rumors, or retaliation will face additional disciplinary action. He then turned to Reynolds. Captain Reynolds, I want to formally apologize on behalf of this facility for the treatment you received. You exercised remarkable restraint and professionalism in how you handled this situation. Your response, documenting the incident, requesting formal review, and allowing proper channels to function, is exactly the correct approach to these kinds of situations. Reynolds nodded once, acknowledging the statement without speaking. You are hereby confirmed in your position as Training Evaluation Officer, Westbrook continued. Your assessment results from this week's evaluations are approved for documentation. You will continue in this role for as long as the assignment requires. You have my full support and the support of command. He stood, which signaled the end of the proceeding. You are all dismissed. Novak, you will report to administrative support at 0800 hours tomorrow. Hollis and Reeves, you will wait for assignment notification. As the personnel filed out of the room, Novak walked past Reynolds without looking at her. Hollis followed. Reeves paused for just a moment, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he turned away. Reynolds remained standing in the room after they'd left, her position unchanged, her expression unaltered. She looked exactly the same as she had at the beginning of the proceeding, completely composed, completely controlled, completely aware of exactly what had just occurred and what it meant. Westbrook approached her once the others had departed. You handled this exactly right, he said quietly. The evaluation, the documentation, all of it. You gave them a chance to be dealt with through legitimate channels, and you made sure there was evidence if it ever became necessary to take it further. Reynolds didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was measured, professional. The assessment continues through Friday. Personnel will rotate through the remaining stations. The documentation will be complete and filed through proper administrative channels. Good, Westbrook said. Do whatever you need to do. You have full authority and institutional backing. Reynolds nodded, and then she turned and walked out of the conference room, her bearing unchanged, her focus already shifting to what came next. The message had been delivered. The consequences had been documented. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. What remained now was to let the reality of those consequences settle into the facility, and to establish a new normal where everyone understood exactly what happened when you underestimated the quiet person in the room. The eastern hangar looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago, yet everything about it had changed. The metal surfaces still reflected the harsh fluorescent lights in the same way. The equipment racks still stood in their designated positions. The helicopters in various stages of maintenance still occupied the same spaces. But the atmosphere, the current that ran through the facility, had been fundamentally altered in ways that would persist long after the immediate crisis had passed. Reynolds stood near her original workstation, methodically organizing tools and components into their proper storage locations. It was late Friday afternoon, the final day of the 2-week evaluation period. The training assessments had concluded. The documentation had been filed. The consequences had been distributed. Now she was simply finishing the work she'd been assigned, completing the cycle with the same precision and focus she'd brought to every task since arriving at Harrington Aerospace. The hangar was quieter than it had been in weeks. The usual chatter and camaraderie that had characterized the crew dynamics had largely disappeared, replaced by something more muted and cautious. Personnel moved through their assigned tasks with focus and efficiency, but without the loose banter that typically defined an industrial workspace. The absence of that casual aggression, that performative dominance, created a vacuum that hadn't yet been filled by something healthier. Garrett Novak arrived for his final shift before the formal transfer to administrative support took effect. He was visibly diminished, not physically but in bearing. The reduction in rank was visible in his insignia, which was now noticeably less impressive. His movements through the hangar were more subdued, less commanding. He went directly to his assigned work area without the usual performance of greeting or establishing dominance. When he passed by Reynolds' station, he didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't attempt to acknowledge what had occurred. He simply moved past, the message in his silence more eloquent than any words could have been. He had attempted to challenge her and had failed completely. The system had responded. His position had been diminished. The natural order, at least in his understanding of it, had been restored, but with him on the lower end of the hierarchy. Reynolds didn't look up as he passed. She continued her work with uninterrupted focus, her attention entirely on the task at hand. She wasn't celebrating or acknowledging his diminished status. She wasn't performing victory or dominance. She was simply present, continuing to do the work she'd been assigned to do, treating the entire situation as resolved and therefore no longer requiring her attention. By mid-afternoon, Derek Hollis arrived to receive his assignment notification. It was delivered through the administrative office, a transfer to maintenance support in a different facility location, essentially a lateral move that was technically a demotion in terms of status and opportunity. He packed his personal items from his station and left without saying goodbye to anyone. Tomas Reeves followed a similar pattern. He collected his things and departed without ceremony, understanding that his previous status within the hangar hierarchy had been fundamentally compromised by his association with Novak and his participation in the assault. By 3 p.m., it was as though they'd never been significant figures in the hangar's social structure at all. The crew continued working, the systems continued operating, and the facility functioned exactly as it had before their arrival, which was the point, really. The hangar had been running long before Novak had consolidated his personal power, and it would continue running after his influence had been stripped away. Marcus Thornton, the supervisor, approached Reynolds near the end of the shift. He stood for a moment without speaking, observing her work. Then he said, quietly, "Thank you." Reynolds paused, looking up from the manifold she'd been examining. "For what?" she asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than rhetorical. "For handling this the way you did," Thornton said. "A lot of people would have made it more complicated, would have escalated it immediately, made it personal, created more damage. You gave the system a chance to work." Reynolds returned her attention to the manifold. "The system was designed to work this way. I simply used it." "I know," Thornton said, "but most people don't know how to do that. Most people either fight back immediately or they accept the treatment as inevitable. You found a third path." Reynolds didn't respond. She was already moving on to the next task, already focusing on what came next rather than reflecting on what had passed. A new recruit wandered through the eastern hangar section around 4 p.m. He was young, probably early 20s, with the kind of facial sunburn and uncertain bearing that came with being newly assigned to an industrial facility. He was clearly lost, looking around the hangar with the confusion of someone who didn't yet understand the facility's layout or the unwritten rules governing movement through the various spaces. Reynolds observed him for a moment, then pointed with minimal gesture toward the administrative building. "Personnel assignment office is through the north corridor. First right turn." The recruit nodded, mumbled a thank you, and headed in the direction she'd indicated. He didn't ask who she was, didn't seem to recognize anything special about her. She was simply another person in the hangar who'd provided helpful information. She watched him go, then returned to her work. This was what the aftermath looked like. The integration of normal activity with the understanding that something significant had occurred and been resolved. The facility continued functioning. New people arrived, unaware of the recent dynamics. And the people who'd been present for those dynamics adjusted their understanding of the social and power structures they inhabited. As the shift ended and personnel began the process of securing stations and preparing for departure, Reynolds completed her final organizational tasks. She removed her work gloves, cleaned her hands at the industrial sink, and moved toward the exit. Several mechanics nodded as she passed. One offered a brief verbal greeting. She acknowledged them without stopping, her trajectory clearly directed toward the exit and whatever came after the working hours. In the barracks that evening, Reynolds sat in her room with the small canvas duffel that had accompanied her since arrival. She didn't unpack it. Instead, she simply sat on the edge of the bed, her posture perfect even in a moment of apparent rest, her mind clearly processing information and planning next steps. The assignment at Harrington had accomplished what it had been designed to accomplish. She'd integrated into the facility. She'd documented the culture and the dynamics. She'd identified the problems in the organization and had allowed those problems to reveal themselves and their consequences through legitimate channels. She'd established that authority, when properly exercised, could reshape institutional culture without requiring ongoing conflict or confrontation. The black belt remained wrapped in cloth at the bottom of the duffel. She hadn't needed to unwrap it. The effectiveness of her training had been demonstrated without requiring her to explicitly display credentials or reference her background. The documentation of her capabilities existed now in the security footage, in the training assessments, in the official record of what she was capable of accomplishing. By Monday morning, she would have new orders, a new assignment, a different facility or a different mission. Harrington Aerospace would continue without her, the hangar would function under new leadership dynamics, and the crew would adjust to a structure that was less based on volume and aggression and more based on actual competence and demonstrated skill. She pulled out her notebook, the one she always carried, the one she never opened in public, and made a final entry. Not detailed, just a few lines summarizing what had occurred, what had been observed, what had been documented. The information would go into official channels, would be filed with the people who needed to know, would contribute to whatever larger assessment or evaluation had brought her to this facility in the first place. In the hangar, long after she'd left, the work continued. The systems hummed. The helicopters waited in their various states of maintenance. The crew moved through their assigned tasks under a new understanding of how authority and respect actually functioned in that space. Not through volume, not through aggression, not through the performance of dominance, but through competence, through clarity, through the establishment of standards and the documentation of how those standards were met or failed to be met. The message had landed, though it hadn't been delivered through words or confrontation. It had been delivered through systems and structure and the simple demonstration that when you underestimate someone, when you assume their silence means weakness, you're not reading the situation correctly. You're missing information. You're making a fundamental miscalculation about what's actually happening in the space you occupy. Reynolds, somewhere else now or somewhere soon to be, carried that message forward, not as something to be explained or discussed, but as something understood at the level of institutional practice. Silent, watchful, ready. The most dangerous person in any room wasn't always the loudest. Sometimes she was the one taking notes, learning the systems, understanding the vulnerabilities, and waiting for the moment when legitimate channels would allow her to reshape what needed reshaping. And Harrington Aerospace, for all its industrial noise and mechanical complexity, had just learned that lesson in ways it would remember for a very long time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.